Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. Sponsored by the Cyclops and Goodman Games, we bring you Getting Sword and Sorcery into your role-playing game. I'm Howard Andrew Jones, the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull, and the rest of my illustrious panel is here with you. I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Joseph?
Sure. Hi, I'm Joseph Goodman of Goodman Games. Played a lot of role-playing games, published some role-playing games, also work with Howard to publish Tales from the Magician's Skull, which is based around cool sword and sorcery fiction. So happy to be here talking about sword and sorcery and RPGs. It's like 2 out of my 3 favorite things in one. If only we could work in ice cream, this would be the perfect panel. All right, Mike, over to you.
Hi, I'm Michael Curtis. I am a writer for Goodman Games, and most in recent memory, I was a lead writer on DCC Lankmar. So I have been steeped in that strong brew, which is Fritz Leiber's Sword and Sorcery for the last 5 years. So I feel, and then I listened to the entire Basil Polduris Conan the Barbarian soundtrack just before getting on this panel. So I am all ready to talk sword and sorcery and gaming.
Hey guys. I'm Harley Stroh. I'm just off of DCC 100, the Music of the Spheres is Chaos, and I'm happy to be here.
Harley wrote a couple things too.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate all of you sitting down together with me virtually. And we only have an hour, so let's get things rolling. I think the first thing we need to do is discuss what the difference is between sort of the standard default role-playing game as far as fantasy versus sort of a more sword and sorcery field. So Joseph, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. I mean, Howard, I feel like you wrote an essay on this. In fact, I think you did. So guys, if you go to the either the Goodman Games website or talesfromtheskull.com, a couple entries down from, I think it was yesterday or today, is an article called Defining Sword and Sorcery by Mr. Howard Andrew Jones, which is less about the differences between fantasy and sword and sorcery and about defining sword and sorcery. But it's a great article. And like, I've been a fan of these stories for years and couldn't articulate it nearly as well as Howard did when he put it in writing. But what are the differences? I mean, I'd say, I'll just start talking and you guys jump in. But one that I think comes to mind is the level of magic. I feel like sword and sorcery has subdued magic. It's not flashy, immense pyrotechnics. You don't have characters throwing magic left and right for minor things, accomplishing whatever they want through the use of a spell. You have, few powerful magics, often associated with great risk and danger to those who obviously receive it, but also who use it. And usually affiliated with like higher powers and dark secrets and mysteries. That's how I think of the magic and sword and sorcery stories, as opposed to a lot of fantasy books where, you memorize your 32 spells, and one of which is like, make cereal. And, in a lot of fantasy novels, like there's just too much magic. It becomes mundane because it's so overused. That's just to start with. What do you guys think?
That's definitely one aspect of it. There's also the fact is that in a lot of it, not only is magic not ever omnipresent, it's also usually in the hands of the antagonist. You get a lot more of the magic is maybe not necessarily evil, but definitely against the goals of the protagonist. And when it is in the hand of the protagonist, it's not always trustworthy. I'm thinking Grey Mouser. Every time he tries to cast a spell, things tend to go awry. That's definitely one aspect of it. We also we get. It's far more. I want to say it was like blue collar type of fantasy as opposed to like high fantasy. Where we get it's the less Excalibur and more like more Conan the Barbarian.
So let's push in on that, Mike. When you say a little more blue collar, like what are you thinking of specifically? Kind of the grit and grime, or what are you after?
I mean, it's the goals more often they're less grandiose than save the universe type thing. It's not like these massive things. It's more like rescue the half-dressed maiden who's been tied to a post and waiting for the iron killer to come out and eat her, or hell, we're out of money. we need to find a way to pay the bar tab this week, I don't know how often we can say like a sword and sorcery hero purposely kind of goes out like to more often than not, it seems like things happen to them, and then it's up to them to work their way out of how they ended up in that situation. It's like I feel that's especially the case with Baffert and the Gray Mouser. It's like it's more often than not they get dragged into something and like we didn't want to do this, or we were just trying to make a buck, and next thing you know, there's we're fighting a winged cultist. It's like we were just trying to rob this guy, and who knows.
Well, and the rewards are more earthy, right? Because like at the end of any good Liber Tale or Robert A. Howard, you're going to end up in the tavern. You start in the tavern and you end in the tavern.
Mm-hmm.
If it's Conan, he's sulking in the corner, with his great melancholies. But like you said, you can. There's grease on your hands when you read a good sword and sorcery tale. You can imagine somebody being a mechanic in his shop and he picks up a wrench and it's to bomb somebody. There's more in line there with sword and sorcery than some other stuff. I think a lot of that speaks to me is that when Conan walks into a bar, and what distinguishes it from perhaps other fantasy is he's the wolf among just all these rabble of mongrel dogs, right? And so he's a very unique character even in that world. If I was to think about like fantasy RPGs, the bartender in a Conan world is not the retired fourth level warrior. That took his money. No, Conan's like the only guy who can do mighty deeds in the room. There's all these reavers and cut persons, but he's the one. He walks in. The whole bar looks to him and knows that he's trouble.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, please. I was going to ask. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that segues perfectly because the feel of it is. It's less grand, although it's also in a way more archetypal. The characters aren't going to come in and at the end of the scenario all end up with a +4 broadsword and a whole bunch of treasure, and they go down to the magic shop and check it in. On the other hand, they're going to begin the adventure as some of the coolest people around. Now, they're not going to be 20th level with levitation rings firing thunderbolts. They're just going to be, I guess, if you're looking at, say, the feel of traditional D&D, maybe 7th, 8th level, who are really competent, but not godlike. A more gritty feel. But then, of course, if you're looking at D&D, the spell use is tuned way down. The amount of treasure is tuned way down. What else can we do to evoke the feel? Let me give you one more thing that I normally do. I use a lot of alternate rules, no matter what system I'm doing. A lot of people use fumbles and crits. Well, I use crits, but I don't use fumbles. Instead of rolling to verify a crit, I roll to verify the fumble. Because Conan and Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser really don't screw up very often. If they've got a 1 in 20 chance of fumbling all the time, that just doesn't evoke the feel of the stories. But what else do you guys do when you're running a game to make it feel more sword and sorcery?
No, that's cool. Hold on. But let's go back to that really quick. The really sweet part about that fumble is, and we may have discussed this, last year, Gen Con or whatever, but you could almost make a sword and sorcery fumble chart, right? Because horrible things are always happening to Conan in combat. He's getting bonked on the back of the head and blood's pouring, obscuring his vision because he got his brow cut and it's, and sweats, stinging his eyes. And so I think there's a potential for it's not a 1 in 20 chance of, Conan dropping his sword and tripping over a invisible turtle. There's a 1 in 20 chance of just the chaos of combat just goes awry for him and he has to deal with the complications of that. And so I think it'd be sweet to that could even be, I don't know, maybe somebody's done it already, but just like a whole list of fumbles that aren't the protagonist screwing up, but things going south by virtue of the chaos of, these foes meeting.
This is actually because of the discussion that we had at Gen Con. Now almost a year and a half ago, almost it feels like at this point. And everything I do remember talking about that, and one of the things I've been playing around with is something akin to that, to the idea of where you don't, if a fumble occurs, it's not a fumble. An event occurs, and then it's not something necessarily bad. Like the tide might turn to the point where Conan, like somebody, something happened, like he'll drop, like the sword gets potentially knocked from his hand because of the circumstances of battle. We'll put it Conan, but it's not like, oh, Conan dropped his sword. It's like, no, like the sword is knocked out of his hand. So now the idea is like you put yourself in a situation where you create a dramatic beat in the story, where now Conan has the opportunity to do like that diving roll and grab the sword, and the following round follow up, and because the guy who's like, you knocked the sword out, and then oh my god, he's got the sword back, that kind of situation where you're presented with a momentary obstacle where it's not just like you step on the invisible turtle. It's like it's again like the blood gets in your eyes, but can you wipe that out and then backhand the blood into the face of your opponent and blind them for a round. So it's less. There's a less 5% chance every time you swing the sword that something bad is going to happen. There's a 5% chance every time you get in the midst of it that some event will occur in the combat that allows you, perhaps it might be a disadvantage, you can't recover at any time, or it's something that you can springboard into something even more exciting. So it's still very much a work in progress, but because this is what we talked about at the R.D. Howard thing. It's been something that's in the back of my mind, trying to get that to work correctly. But so something like that, I think, is not a bad place to launch from. No.
Well, so maybe we need to rewind the conversation a little bit. Could we define what we're thinking of when we say sword and sorcery? Maybe a list of authors and things that kind of fall under the rubric.
Well, I think we could take. We don't want to go too in the weeds, but yeah, maybe briefly touch on it.
Yeah.
Clearly Robert E. Howard and the Conan stories, and Fritz Leiber and the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories. Particularly, I would, if you haven't read them before, I'd say start with Swords Against Death, which probably is the greatest amount of cool stories per book of any of the Lankmar stories. And then if you're going to read only one of the Del Rey Conan volumes, which are much easier to get, praise Crom, than they have been previously, go with the Del Rey volume of The Coming of Conan. It's got the Tower of the Elephant in it and a whole bunch of really excellent ones. And I think if you read those two, you're pretty well grounded. You kind of got the wandering adventurer type of stories, and you got the urban sword and sorcery stories. But there's all kinds of other great stuff. You should watch one of our other panels to get the lowdown on that. We even ran long on our 2.5-hour discussion. It didn't get anywhere close. We could talk about the late, great Charles Saunders and the Amaro stories. We could talk about some of the amazing fiction in this magazine that you may have heard of. Not to shill my work or the work of wonderful peers. But yeah, anyone else want to add anything?
Well, would we include say like Elric or like Hawkmoon in Sword and Sorcery?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's not, it can't be Sword and Sorcery because there's occasionally a little bit of science fantasy involved. I hate people with rigid guidelines. Right. No. Let's include, yeah.
But by that rubric, I would even say you can even get like the John Carter stories, and you could get, that's more Sword and Planet, but at the same point, there's a lot of the same overlap here. You do kind of have the outsider dealing with like the crumbling civilization, and kind of dealing very much a person out of place, which is a common trope that we get through, the Sword and Sorcery thing.
We might want to use that broader envelope of heroic fantasy to describe it. Sword and Sorcery is a flavor of heroic fantasy, right? So heroic fantasy can include that. It can include Tarzan. It can include Hawkmoon. But yeah, it's pretty much the same thing with slightly different stage dressing, right. or the wonderful Lee Brackett stories. Now those are like Sword and Sorcery, except they happen to be occurring on Mars or Venus. But our hero's running around most of the time with a sword and maybe a ray gun that has like 3 shots left.
Right.
Yes. Well, actually, that sums it up pretty well, Howard. The 3 shots left part. In terms of how to get this into your RPG, when you guys touched on this earlier and called it kind of blue collar fantasy, it is often, like you said, Mike, the heroes, not even heroes, first of all, they're usually thieves. They're usually rascals, They're on the side of the law just as often as they're not on the side of the law and being hunted by somebody. But they're almost always poor. having been rich just the night before, almost always trying to come up with enough money to either get drunk, buy more ammunition, like some very pedestrian enterprise is their motivation. Like you said, Mike, they're not trying to, they might save the world by accident, but they only save the world because it got them a tankard of ale along the way. And I think they're often thieves. I think that they're not heroes at all. That to me is a lot of it.
Yeah, you don't really get a sword and sorcery hero who owns real estate. I mean, at least not. Eventually Conan works his way up to it, but to the most part, I mean, one of my favorite moments in any of the Fafhrd Grey Mouser stories is the time they own a house because they steal it. Like they literally steal a house and relocate it, and then they live in that for like a couple months. I mean,
yeah.
When I read that, I was like, that is like the greatest thing I've ever read in this. That's because that's if you come into it from role playing, it's like, yeah, that's what my group would get up to. That's my players like, can we steal a house? It's it's a quiet Friday night. Go on, we'll get some guys drunk. We'll have them carry a house out. Next thing you know.
Yeah,
yeah. It's like a little a nobleman's fancy little basically. What do you call those? It's all the rage now. The portable homes.
Oh, the RV or the tiny homes.
Tiny home that would be carried around by your slaves on palanquin. Well, they don't do it themselves, right? They help and they hire some drunk friends or something.
Yeah.
It's been too long, and then they just move it.
Yeah. They hire a bunch of ne'er-do-wells to help them move it, and then they get them drunk so they don't remember where they put the house when they got there.
I think that's a pretty good just speed intro to the discussion and a definition of it. So here's the question then. How do we create that in our role-playing settings? How do you design a campaign that feels more like that and less like I got a magic shop and I got a 3rd level elf with a +2 bow and yeah, how do you make it feel more like what we're talking about and less that other way?
I just for me is that if I'm running a campaign which I want to do the sword and sorcery vibe, the characters have to be outside of the system. They can't be a part of the system. Yeah. It's like they can't be knights. They can't be, I mean, if they're clerics, they have to be like that weird cleric, that nobody wants to talk to. Like, he worships like the flea god and he lives outside of town and he's like the 3rd person on the list that anybody wants to talk to. It's like if like the priest is drunk and like, and the healer is often somewhere else, like, we gotta go talk to the flea guy. It's a because I mean I don't think there's any real good sword and sorcerer sword and sorcery hero who is like part of the establishment. I mean even Elric who believes as like the emperor of Meldebone, like he literally tears down his entire empire and that I'm no longer part of the establishment. I think beginning there, I mean, and most adventurer, most first level adventurers aren't part of the system anyway. So it's just, just keep them from achieving name level for a while. And, you got 25% of the battle won right there.
Mike,
yeah.
Go ahead, Harley.
Calling out something, Mike, that's kind of unexamined about like, the trope of the murderer hobo is that, as judges and GMs, we don't really treat our player characters as if, like what you're saying, they're not part of the establishment. They're not the other. They're not the ones. The fishmonger and her kids are walking down the street and they see our PCs on the other side, and she hustles her babies off into an alley so that they're not going to be with these unclean, uncouth, unloved strangers that are marauding through town. And I don't know that we always think through the social implications of what it means to, because like you're saying, like the default setting of most RPG characters are this other, this outside character. But I wonder how often we really examine that and follow through on the implications of that when we're running. Right.
And I think they're definitely you have to have the implications. I mean, they have to be outsider. They can't run roughshod over it and have no consequences. I mean, but the idea is they can't, you can't solve the problem by my daddy will pay somebody off and everything will be fine. It's the idea is like, oh no, we have to kidnap daddy and get him to call off the guard, because we don't have any pull in this situation. Like we're living on our wits.
Like you're onto something here. I mean, I think a lot of D&D adventures start with this assumption that you get assignments, so to speak, from royalty, from powerful wizards, from some outside party that wants to retain the services of your adventurers, Whereas I think a sword and sorcery party is often the type that nobody wants to go, like you said, the flea cleric, like nobody wants to go near them because they're a little too rough looking and scraggly looking. And you don't know if they will actually protect the caravan or just mug the caravan once they're outside the city limits, So you're right. I think you're onto something about how they, quote, get their adventures should be completely different from many conventional fantasy adventuring parties.
So if you're going to set up a campaign world and tell your players that you're going to do a sword and sorcery feel, how would you start it? How would you limit the magic user, the person that always wants to play the magic user? I, for instance, would probably not start everyone at first level where everyone's a nebbish and can't succeed very often. Dungeon Crawl Classics, I'd probably put them at probably like what, third level maybe? I don't know. Talk about this. What do you do to create the environment and sculpt the player's approach to characters? What would you say to them?
I wouldn't feel the need to put them at like third level or something. I mean, everybody who doesn't have a lot of direct experience with DCC is like, oh, it's the most lethal game ever, and once you get a first level character going, and especially if you have a cleric or something, they're pretty robust. So, I mean, one of the reasons we did with Lankmar, you start at first level, because your first level can handle a lot of stuff, and you do get that feeling of like, okay, all right, we may not be the toughest people in the joint, but we can handle ourselves. We're not, fishmongers with a stick, so I wouldn't necessarily have to start them at a higher level.
But I like where Howard's going in the sense of like, what would you do differently about the way you structure the game? Right. I think part of it is outside forces working on the heroes, which you guys kind of talked about, and whether you start them at whatever level you start them at, like they have to end up broke at some point, and they have to end up unexpectedly broke through outside forces. Either like, and I feel like we published a couple things that had these kinds of events tables, but like normally you go to bed, you wake up and you've healed your 2 hit points or whatever. But in this kind of setting, you should go to bed, wake up, you're healed, and somebody stole all your money, or like broke into your tavern room or something like that,
I know we talk about consequences, but I think there's also you can't have like 100% safe choice. Like like if you have to make a decision, it's never, like if the only safe division is we put down our weapons and we go work on the docks, like that's it. Like we give up adventuring, and even then some first level adventurer might come along and stab us. It's like the idea is like, okay, well, all right, well that guy down the street, he's looking for some help. But if we go help him, then there's a guy who doesn't like him, and maybe they're at opposing forces. But if we're helping out him, then this guy doesn't like us now. Or or if we make a sacrifice to this priest, well then that temple down there is going to get offended by that. So it's landmines, but they're not like, no landmine is just going to blow you up. I mean, I think because you have to. I think anytime we go out there and we are engaging in the world, in the kind of the overall campaign world, we should never be, because we are outsiders, there's no easy choices. Like the only easy day was the day before you started rolling your dice, is what I'm saying, is, and we get that a lot with Lankmar, with the idea of carousing. Like you get drunk and you go out, and then you wake up the next morning and you have, you've pissed off the flea god again, and now you're infested with fleas, and your luck's all back, but now you're flea infested, and now we have to go solve that problem. I think that's just like me personally. I just no, Harley, Joe, you had something against on?
Well, I was just saying, so if you guys were running the sword and sorcery game, is there space for magic items? Is there space for the legendary blade and that sort of thing?
I would say yes. Legendary blades. It's just too much fun to have the magic stuff. You're probably going to end up with a higher magic feel than what you get in the sword and sorcery, because we're all used to running it, but you can dial it back. And I think the trick would be make them far more distinctive. It's not a +1 sword.
Yeah.
Something Bryce Lynch over in the 10-foot pole, he once said on some review, it's so much cooler not to get a +1 sword, but get a +1 sword with a terrible name, constantly drips blood, and it's called like a Krondark, Slayer of Men. So you don't have a +1 sword. I bear Krondark, Slayer of Men, which is, yeah,
right.
Stuff like that.
Right, and that should be acquiring one should be a purpose. It shouldn't be something that happens incidentally. It's not like, oh, we killed off guard number 5 and we loot him over and he's got a +1 dagger on him. You know, he just
got a magic whip and a bow of healing. No, no.
So maybe when we presume that sword and sorcery are low magic, maybe, but it's counterintuitive. But the magic items that do show up are really significant and really powerful.
Right.
You know, it's not a +5% chance on a 20-sided die. Like this, the sword has a history and also is going to accomplish really cool things.
Right. And
so the magic we do encounter is going to be awesome magic and not boring magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, I like what you were saying about master craft stuff. I mean, the magic sword, it's not a +1 because it's magic. It's just super finely crafted. It's made of Hyrcanian steel. So it's like a +2, but it's just because it's so razor sharp. It's ultra rare. You know, something like that would be the way to do it.
So basically what we're saying is that, you know, if you acquire any sort of, you know, magic sword or something that's really like, you know, like a relic or something with power, it shouldn't be because you got chased by dogs and had to hide in a tomb and they found like a body there and you took the sword and the rust fell off and it was Atlantean's sword and you used it for 2 movies. It was like, you should purposely have to seek out that tomb, you know. So,
well, yeah, well, remember, that's from the movie. That's not from...
No, that's what I'm saying. It's like the movie gets it wrong.
Adapted from Lynn Carter's story, right? That's
there you go.
Yeah.
So I think another aspect, so we've talked about sort of scarcity of magic or how magic's used and, you know, outside forces working on you. I think we should talk about how all the characters are basically thieves. You know, like Conan, if you were to pick a class for him, I mean, he's obviously a warrior, but he's got a lot of thief skills, you know, so in D&D terms, he's multi-class or some sort of hybrid class, you know, and I think, you know, the same argument can be made for Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. So there's some element of living by your wits, you know, which becomes in D&D terms random thief skills that any sword and sorcery hero has because they're constantly hiding from the guy who's trying to kill them, trying to escape the tax man. You know, like you said, Mike, they just made angry the last guy who helped them. So now they're trying to, you know, sneak into the compound of the guy who will save them. Like there's a lot of sneaking, hiding, and that kind of stuff going on.
I agree. You either have to do, I remember when I was a young man in junior high and high school doing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I saw all kinds of crazy multi-class builds for Conan and even Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. They were sort of absurd. It's like they had to make them fit the rules as they were. They had to do all this absurd stuff instead of like house ruling some stuff, making everyone capable of backstabbing, which I've seen like crypts and things and some other alternate Dungeons and Dragons systems use. What would you do to house rule some stuff to make a sword and sorcery feel more palatable so they don't have to all multi-class or whatever?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the things that some of the later iterations of like D&D does correctly, like 5th edition. All of the stuff which in the original editions were all like very class specific. Like only a thief could perform class stuff. But with the later incarnations of the game, that's actually a skill. So you could be a cleric and still have like the necessary skills that you know to filch somebody's stuff. So it's less class dependent. It's just, you know, it's like you to one of those things like, okay, I want to run something which is very, very much in that vein. Like everybody as default, you gain proficiency in like stealth and sleight of hand. All right, so right there, those you get two free skill points or whatever. And then you don't have to worry about, okay, then, well, I'm a fighter magic user, thief acrobat or anything like that. It's just, it's like, that's one way to do it if you were using a system that has a skill parameters like that. Something with DCC, since it comes from that very old school stuff, you have the stuff like the skills are kind of like hard baked into the class. So it's a little bit more difficult to pull that off. But what we did with Langmar, depending on what your kind of cultural upbringing is, you might have been like spent a brief period as a thief. So you begin the game with, you might be a warrior, but you might have 4 thief skills. So that's one way that we kind of address that fact of the multi-class thing. But without having to worry about, okay, well, 50% of my experience points goes here and 50% of my experience point goes there. So.
And how about magic? So the friend of yours who always wants to play the wizard, how do you let someone play a magic user in a sword and sorcery setting? What do you do to make it interesting for them? Or do you just say no, sorry, not this time? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it comes back to he's that one character. He or she is the one warlock in town that perhaps he was tied to a stake. That's your starting encounter, right? Is the magic user is tied to the stake. They're setting the wood on fire, and then your warrior and your thief stumbled into town. They're half drunken for whatever. They have this vision that they need to free this magic user off the post. I think we need to imagine it as if it were out in the real world, right? If you walk into church and your hand catches fire and you're able to put half the congregation to sleep, they're all going to chase you out into the streets and try to string you up. Like, we think the fear that would come from people perceiving somebody who was capable of warping reality would be palpable, right? We would all be it's almost like X-Men. We would all be terrified of this person's abilities and our own inability to warp reality. And so, any spellcaster is going to, the whole town's going to want to string them up or chase them out of town. And that, and it goes back to what Joseph was saying earlier, that, but sometimes you really need somebody who can warp reality to deal with the problems that you have in your life. but so can you play a wizard? Absolutely. But know that as someone who can transform gold into whatever, that is able to actually work magic, that comes with massive social implications that you may or may not want to deal with.
Right.
I think that's a good call, Harley. I think it's interesting how in a lot of the sword and sorcery stories, the wizards, they have extremely powerful rituals that can summon major demons and, wreak havoc across the world. And yet they hardly ever use their magic because it seems so hard to execute, and it always seems to involve a lot of work and a lot of rituals and a lot of components. And so for all their power, and everybody fears them so much, and yet they hardly ever use the magic, and the fear seems almost unfounded. Like, what sword and sorcerer wizard is going to waste his time smiting a peasant? They don't use their magic that way. They use their magic to bring forth the undead legion, that then invades the city, or open a hole in the sky, and a claw comes down. So in a weird way, you're right. There's this total like Salem witch kind of effect where everybody fears you and wants to see you burn at the stake because they're just scared of you. But you don't actually get to do that much, and they rarely actually witness any acts of magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think going on the idea of what you were saying is that there's they can do all this powerful stuff, but there's all this ritual involved and everything. One of the things that you could do is make, if you're running something other than DCC where magic is inherently weird and unpredictable, if you're running something which is a little bit more bog standard fantasy like D&D or something, what you can do is you add an element of you make magic an event. To the part where okay, you can have your cantrip and you can cast this spell how many times a day you want or whatever like that. But if you want to pull off something don't take stuff away from them, but give them an opportunity to do stuff even better by okay, you can cast clairvoyance. And maybe see what's behind the wall of the castle. But if you really want to get in to see what's in the in the prince's treasury and stuff like that, you have to get the essence of the Black Lotus, which only blooms once a year out in the swamp of death. So at that point it's okay, now it's quest for it. It's okay, let's go get the Black Lotus thing, and then this way we can come back, and that's the only way we're really going to pull this off. But if you do pull it off, it's like something, aha, I did more than just cast my 3rd level spell. It's I cast a spell which has the effects of what might have been like a 5th level spell, but I can only do it this one time because the Black Lotus stuff only blooms once a year or whatever.
I think we've all raised some good points here. If we're a game master setting out to design a setting and kind of adventures, I think we need to be thinking about how to make it different from, again, sort of bog standard feel. And I think one of the most important things is sense of wonder. Joseph and I were putting a list of ideas together for an upcoming project for the skull. And we were talking about one of the differences between sword and sorcery and grimdark. And in grimdark, at its very worst and most stereotypes. Everyone's a jerk, everything's covered in crap, and everything's bleak and hopeless. And sword and sorcery, some people, oh, sword and sorcery is old grimdark. No, not really. It's gritty and blue collar, but there's sense of wonder everywhere. Not everywhere, but you go someplace and there's sense of wonder, and there's horror, but there's also fantastic lost cities and terrors beyond imagination, and fantastic sights and beautiful things and stunning ruins and vistas that mortal men have not beheld for 1,000 years, that kind of thing. How do we bring that out so it's not just another standard setting? What do we do with our language and the monsters and stuff?
Actually, Howard, you make me think of a saying, which is the best days are behind us. You know, there's some civilizations where they're like on the up and up. And I think a lot of the sword and sorcery, you know, way back when they conquered the world and the, you know, creatures from space brought great magic and somebody uncovered a great portal to somewhere, but all that happened a long time ago. And now those days are long past and things are just slowly going downhill. You know, not that they're, like you said, dark and ominous, but the best days are in the past. So I think to some extent that creating that feeling somehow in what you do is important to get sword and sorcery.
I will even take it to the point where not only the best days are past, but to the point where at a heart, a lot of sword and sorcery is essentially post-apocalyptic. You know, there has been a great civilization in the past, which has not only reached its, you know, its apex of its great time, but has since crashed and burned. And you are now slowly coming out of the, you know, out of the ruins of that. You're on the ascent again, but you know, you get the feeling that you're never going to achieve those same, you know, the same lofty goals of the you know, of the wreckage of the past. And the best thing you can do is kind of maybe, you know, salvage some of that stuff and, you know, kind of bring it forward with you. And that's where you get your ancient ruins that need to be plundered with their magical items, and that's where you have like the ancient creature that was spawned in the laboratory of, you know, of Atlantis, and now they have fled to the continent, and now they're breeding in the jungles, and you know, so I mean, there you have your sense of wonder and everything, but it's grounded in, you know, it's grounded in more of a, you know, okay, well, you know, we might not have vast kingdoms anymore, we might have city states. And, you know, city-states might be going to war over, okay, well, hey, that place has, you know, for example, the Great War Machine, you know, the elephant or something, if we want to bring this into, you know, so let's go and try to get the elephant. And of course, the elephant can be an actual elephant, or it could be some sort of weird techno device or magical construct or something that was created 1,000 years ago before the seas drank Atlantis, you know.
No, you're onto something. And how do you get that into game terms and into something that the players interact with, like an actual monster or actual NPC or something like that? How do you capture that feel?
I think every monster, it's like, oh, hey, you look around the corner, it's an orc. No. Most of your foes in sword and sorcery are going to be understandable. You got to think of a horror movie. When you see something that's not a man or something recognizable, it ought to be a little bit concerning for you. So a monster is an event, not just another chance for hit points. It's something terrifying. It's either a distraction that the villain sends, or it's a villain, or it's an obstacle on the way to the goal. Either way, it's a major point. It's not just, oh, hey, it's an encounter, we fight some goblins, we did this, we fight that, then we get the treasure. No, it's part of an unfolding story. It's a major thing that you're going to remember.
Right. No. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that.
Yeah, when you think about how few creatures get battled in a typical, you know, one of these stories we reference, it's not like there's a constant stream of goblins. You know, it's a handful of encounters, each one of which is significant.
Well, let's talk about the structure of how do you start one? How do you keep up the pace? Because pace is an important aspect of sword and sorcery stories, right? They don't get bogged down. How do you get it started? How do you keep it moving? What little tips and tricks would you advise people who want to get a sword and sorcery feel into their adventure? What would you advise them, the game masters, to do?
I don't know if I would know if it would work with every adventure, but if I was starting the campaign, the first words out of my mouth would be roll for initiative. I mean, because literal just start in action, like, and it's like what in media res, like, okay, you guys are on a hilltop and there are like, cavemen, who are there after you, and they have wild hyenas and they have a burning effigy of their god. And you look down and you have the other head of the god that you managed to pick up because there's like golden coconuts part of it or something, whatever else. And then, and they're coming and they're pissed. And then, so let's resolve this fight. And then,
That's great.
the very first Lightbar module that I wrote, it literally begins with all the characters in the basement of a noble's villa, and they're all getting ready. They're all just outside the vault, and the guardsmen come down, and so they immediately get in a fight with the guardsmen. And then what I do is I ask them, okay, how did you get here? And then every one of the players had to come up with an idea, like, okay, like one of them, I was like, oh, I dressed up as one of the servants, and there's another guy's like, I burrowed through the wall, and so they all arrive at the same time, and then they realize that they have to kind of team up in order to defeat the treasure of the vault and everything. But you begin with the dice immediately hitting the table, and that you have this way the players don't have to sit around and listen to your 12-page backstory about how things came to be or whatever. It's like let them discover by playing, and that's how I would kick off a campaign. I don't think that's going to work every adventure, but
Harley, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, no, yeah, I think it's difficult because we've been so, DCC is just, it's in this stew already. So everything I say is just going to sound like it's come out of the DCC core book. But when you were speaking to that sense of wonder and discovery, that only can happen when the players don't know what the characters are going to encounter. And so, if it was an established setting where I have my core book on the setting, and I have my gazetteer on the 14 different kingdoms, and my players have been kind of steeped in the fiction, for the last 20 years, it's really hard to convey that sense of wonder that we want our players to experience through their characters if they already know that city outside of town is an elven city with portals back in time to when the elves ruled the world. So you really want to start your characters and your players by consequence of it with a really small sense of what their world is. Maybe they know Samaria really well, but they've now marched into this foreign land that they've only heard legends of and rumors of, and there's a town down below, but they don't know how they're going to be greeted. But that sense of wonder can only come when it's actually unknown to the players as well as the characters, which is just what we say in the DCC core book.
It's worth repeating though, and it's easy to miss that little bit somewhere in that thick book. So that's the important part. Yeah.
When we talk about structure, another idea, but you definitely have to get player investment in that. You have to make sure everybody's on the same on the same page here, and everybody's cool with the idea. The idea would be run a very picaresque campaign where it's like every adventure it's like a short story from like the Conan anthology or anything. So you're not worried about the connective tissue in between. Okay, we have all right, we're going to do this kind of adventure this week, and then these 3 weeks, and then so we have the lost pyramid adventure. We're fighting, reptile mummies or something like that. And then we wrap up that adventure. And then the next time we get together at the table, the game master is like, all right, 6 weeks ago, having defeated the desert of dust, you find yourself aboard the ship, off the coast of of the scheming jungles, and then immediately roll into something else. Where the characters' actions have repercussions, but we're not worried about downtime. We're keeping that pace up. We're not worried about okay, all right, and this week we're going to go hang out in the tavern, and all right, well, we got to cash in the gems we found, and Bill needs to buy new armor, or whatever. It's no, we take care of all that downtime. We do that in email if we have to. So it's just constantly what's going to go on this week. So, and that's not to say that the Pharaoh of the Dust Mummies who you fought 3 adventures ago can't come back. But it's just you don't have to worry about dealing with his minions every week or anything like that.
Every Thursday. Right. It's Mike, it's funny you mentioned that. I was just rereading Village of Hamlet to refresh my memory on it. And there's all these, he's discussing the trading post area, and Gygax specifies that they usually buy at 87% of list value and then sell at 110. And there's so much mundane detail put into the act of haggling and transacting. When I was rereading that, it reminded me of like that era of D&D when nowadays it's like at least in the way I like to play, you dispense with the mundane stuff. I'm not going to, it doesn't make me happy to role play buying a sword, So we just kind of let it go at list price. But there was this era where they did all that, and it was like this extended haggle to get your sword, and
but I don't think that's necessary. That's not even necessary. Just a time and era. There are just some people who really like simulationist gaming. They like to be able. Okay, I have to figure out exactly how much my castle is going to cost. So I'm going to sit down and measure out. Okay, I need 100 feet of curtain wall, and then, so it's 10 gold pieces per curtain wall, and do the entire thing. And there was a time when I thought that was fun. I was like, okay, I'll just figure this out. I have to figure out how much money I'm going to get. But like the older you get, the more I'm like, all right, whatever. Let's tweak.
I agree with that, but I also think there's an element of sword and sorcery dispenses with the mundane. You don't ever read a story about Conan haggling for how much he's going to pay for the inn, or like selling his bar tab. Well, what if I give you 12 coppers? Like there's this element of it really does. I mean, I guess a lot of heroic fantasy, maybe this isn't sword and sorcery per se. There's a lot of just getting to dramatic scenery, and dispensing with the rest. And I think maybe a way to capture that in the RPGs is to do that. Like you said, jumping from episode to episode without like, cool, you think you needed a broadsword. Let's just say you got it,
Right. Well, that's why I say that like if you're going to run like the picaresque campaign, you have to make sure that all the players are on the right page.
Yeah.
Because you might be playing with that group there. Where is that one guy? He wants to barter for every 12 copper pieces, and he wants to figure out how much his curtain wall thing, and he's not going to have a fun time if he doesn't get to do that. So you just and you have to either say, well, we're not going to do that, or you have to like, all right, every 10 sessions we'll have an adventure in the city of thieves, and then we get to barter with everybody you want or everything, but
on your way past the jungles of Katai, you make a pit stop at the flea market. Exactly. Now you can haggle for a while.
Very nice. Harley, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was just going to echo what Joseph was saying, that as many of us are parents, but when you have a game session where that no matter what, every session is going to be founded on adventure and not the mundane stuff, it really respects. In a lot of ways, it respects your players and the time that they're investing in the campaign to know that they're going to show up, they're going to encounter something of substance, and it's not going to be whatever the haggling. And when I was 8, I spent days deciding are these going to be boots high and hard, or the soft and low boots. There's a really big difference in that in the AD&D Player's Handbook. But I think to run games where that something amazing is going to happen each session would get us closer in line with sword and sorcery fiction.
Yeah.
About I think one of the things I try to advise people on fiction, especially if they're getting ready to submit something, I'd say, give us interesting people going to interesting places for interesting reasons. So hopefully the characters are going to be interesting, and your players have done that. So the game master has to give them interesting reasons to go to interesting places. So we have to construct really exciting things for them to see. Instead of like, oh, it's a stone entrance to a dungeon, it's a hallway, it's dark. We've got to make it splendid, right? A glowing green stone carved with ancient sigils that will blow your mind if you stare too long at them. I'm losing my conjuring ability here, but you see where I'm going, right? I think if you're going to evoke the feel, you got to dig deep and pull out those adjectives and really go for the gusto to make it feel cinematic.
One of the challenges with that, though, is that, and just talking out loud, like a lot of the great sword and sorcery fiction has undescribable or unnameable, or sort of it chalks over a lot of stuff. And then, when you're playing the game, they're like, well, what does it look like? Well, can you draw it for me? What do I see? Like, so how do you sometimes take the unspeakable and turn it into, a player handout? How do you retain that sense of wonder and mystery sometimes?
Well, I think without doing the whole idea, it warps your mind if you stare at it because the angles are not quite Euclidean. You're going to have to not
Right.
do that part very often. You'll just have to talk about decrepit stone and strange angles, and it makes you feel dizzy if you stare at it too long. Bring it back to the physical and the reaction, but don't go that particular route too often, or everyone's gonna, oh, it's one of those again. No.
I think one of the things what you do is that you avoid describing it to the point of like you don't try to nail it down in the minutia of it. I mean, that works for anything. Like you don't describe, you don't describe like the barkeep, he's got, big bushy eyebrows and he's got a scar over here and it looks like he hasn't shaved in a couple of days and, he's got a freckle over here, I mean, because nobody cares and nobody's going to remember all this. All right. It's like reading Raymond Chandler. Like Raymond Chandler has some of the best descriptive things. Like one of his famous lines is like he had the voice of a man who just won a pie eating contest. Like that's one of his lines of dialogue. And it tells you absolutely nothing physically descriptive. But if I tell you that, everybody in their head has like, okay, I can picture the voice of a man who just won a pie eating contest. It's sometimes you throw the ball at the players and you let their own imagination fill in the blanks,
Yeah, that's pretty funny. I wonder how many pie eating contests he witnessed before he came up with that line.
I don't know. I think but that's the thing. You don't have to. I've never seen a pie eating contest, but I read that line, it's like I can picture this guy. I can imagine what that voice sounds like.
Yeah.
So, you're very jolly.
Yeah. And like about to burp something up every time he talks. Like that's pretty funny.
I just for going back less on description, but we're still talking about when we were talking about pace and structure. This summer I ran a campaign for a couple of different groups that was going on, and I learned something running that game which hadn't really occurred to me, because I think a lot of us come from the old school background where when we were younger, we were told when you play like D&D, you start as a first level character and you play as long as the campaign goes, because you hear all these stories about, oh yeah, he's got a campaign that's been going for 5 years and it's in the same world and everything, and you keep going until you either reach name level and retire, or more likely the campaign implodes because Bill yelled at Rick and all the rest of that stuff happened. But this summer I said, okay, I'm going to run a campaign. I'm going to run you guys, and it's going to be 10 weeks. Like that's it. Like we're going to have 10 weeks. I knew that's how long it was going to go. So every week when I had that, there was no fat on that campaign. Like everything was lean and mean. There was nothing like, okay, like we have to set this thing up. And it was like, no, game 3, we're on a space pterodactyl and we're flying to the moon. It was like, it was like there's no sense to hold back. And because I think that's the urge of us is like, oh, I have a great idea, but I don't want to introduce it too early in the campaign. You're right. It's like, I'm going to wait till they're like 7th level. No, don't do that. Just say, okay, we're going to play, whether it's 10 weeks, whether it's 20 weeks, just know that, because this way you're on a timetable and like, okay, I'm not holding back the flaming, I'm not flaming back the flaming idol of the hyena people again. We're going to they have a bigger one now and they're showing up on game session 3, and they're outside your little hut, and again, there's that idea of like that sense of wonder. It's like, because every week it's like, oh, I don't know what we're going to counter this week, but I bet you it's going to be interesting. I bet you not going to be 5 copper pieces and haggling with the blacksmith,
We're running low on time, so I think that's a perfect segue into a quick discussion of mortality. Mm-hmm. What do you think about mortality in the sword and sorcery story? How do we handle that for the characters?
Well, the characters never die in sword and sorcery because there's always more. There's always check to be made. You don't have to worry about Conan dying off. So
well, but Conan doesn't know that though, right? I mean, that's why he's sneaking through the tower, because he's worried about he's going to run into somebody that could kill him.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think there's anything wrong with like making the characters heroes in this. And making them a little indestructible. I mean, there's always to be the threat of danger, but I don't think it's necessary to be like, oh God, we can't manage to. Whether you want to do it like with DCC, we have luck. Okay, we know if I get really in trouble, I have luck. I have some sort of meta currency I could spend in this. And whether you want to do that as like crom points or something, like okay, like oh, you're at 0 hit points, I spend a crom point, and then it's like, okay, you're not dead, you're just you're knocked out, or you have 1d3 hit points left or something like that. Eventually you run out of crom points, but you don't have to worry about dying because you got into a fight with the the blind beggar. Well, not that you should be fighting a blind beggar anyway if you're doing a true sword and sorcery campaign, but like you don't have to worry about dying against fighting the evil wizard's third mook from the left. So, or you could even have characters like, okay, you're going up against a high wizard, and crom points don't work when you're fighting the high wizard. So this way you have something.
Yeah, or maybe death isn't the punishment, but like Conan gets knocked unconscious and he wakes up and he's crucified outside of town, and a vulture is trying to eat his eyeballs out. And so the consequence of losing that combat is you wake up and you're in a worse situation.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great call, Harley. Because I mean, a lot of these guys, you're right, they don't quite die, but they frequently get knocked out or incapacitated and wake up in a rough spot, imprisoned, captured, tied up. That's a great call. Maybe when you get to 0 hit points, you basically, there's a table you roll on, and it's the wake up in a tough spot table. Or there's like a series of adventures that open from that point. You wake up as a slave or something. I love that idea.
Right. But and that could be something like, okay, you get knocked out, then you're put in a situation where, I mean, the thing that players hate is like, they're in prison, like they're in a dungeon, because now you robbed them of all agency. But like that's like, okay, so now you're in a dungeon, you're in like the cells underneath the the evil warlock's tower or something like that. Okay, but all right, I spend a crom point, and the evil warlock's young daughter, or the guard who really hates his boss comes down, and you have spent now this currency, and you now have developed this situation. And they're like, you know what, I hate my boss. I tell you what, I want to break you guys out. And then then they don't have to sit there and worry about, okay, like, all right, so I'm going to pretend I'm sick. And you guys, take your loincloth and put rocks in it and hide behind because there's none of that slow time. It's like, okay, now we're just jumping into the next situation. And now the whole thing is, how do we get out of the corridor that leads up to the high priest, thing?
Absolutely. I mean, that's great. I love all of these ideas. That's so much more interesting. You just get the guy comes to him and says, okay, yeah, I'm going to get you out of here, but I got to warn you, there's a giant lizard loose in here, and I don't know. Yeah.
Exactly.
Freed you, and he's leading you through the maze out the back way, and then all of a sudden he gets eaten by a lizard. So then you got to fight the giant rainbow lizard from Grognock.
No, you're right. When he rescues you, he's like, I'm only 2 days on the job because the lizard ate the last guy.
Well, hey, we're about over here time-wise, so why don't we just is there any other advice you have to share that we haven't hit that we want to close out with?
I just say, if you're not reading Sword and Sorcery and you want to run Sword and Sorcery, start reading Sword and Sorcery. I mean, there's anything that we've told you in the last hour pales in comparison to what people who have been writing Sword and Sorcery much better than we have been talking about it for the last hour. Steal from the best. That's
steal from the best. I would just say, every time I have one of these cons and listen to all the guys talk about the seminars, I come away with 30 more books that I want to read. But this one makes me just want to go back and reread Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Conan. I mean, just rereading that suite of, 5 or 10 central stories is alone enough to be very inspiring. So maybe that's what I'll read next.
Makes me want to read Tales from the Magician's Skull.
Yeah, I heard of that magazine. I hear it's pretty good.
Yeah. Bad shilling job, boss. That's it.
Harley, any final words from you?
No words of wisdom here. No, I'm an empty vessel, but I've been taking notes.
You're hardly an empty vessel. Guys, this has been a blast. I bet we could keep going for another hour, but let's go.
Always leave them wanting more.
Leave them wanting more. If you guys were local, I'd say let's go grab some food, because it's about supper time here, but you're scattered across the multi-dimensions. So,
yeah. It was fun chatting with you guys. That was fun.
Thanks to all of you, and thanks for you who have turned in and will be turning in the future.